If I asked you to create a three-point specialist in your head, chances are they probably wouldn't look like 3D. A long-range marksman that looked more like he should be posting up down low. As while three-point shooters were no longer rare in his era, there weren't too many that looked like him. A college superstar for Georgia Tech, Dennis Scott was a guy who would pass up an open lane to the hoop to take a three-pointer instead, eventually joining the Magic in their second year of existence, and possibly playing an unintentional role in the Magic being able to draft Shaq a couple years later. And even though Scott was never at the level of any of Shaq's better-known running mates, their on- and off-court chemistry made them a fun combo in the early 90s, with Scott playing a big role on the championship-contending Magic teams of the mid-90s as a record-breaking three-point shooter. But injury and inconsistency caused a swift career decline for the once top 5 pick. Yet in his prime, he made life easier on Shaq, as he could absolutely catch fire at any given time. Let's jog your memory. Born in Maryland, by his teenage years, Dennis Scott was living in Oakton, Virginia, and would enroll at Flint Hill Academy, where he would be nothing short of amazing, earning a third-team All-American distinction as a sophomore, then upping that to a second team as a junior, while leading the Falcons to a top national ranking. Then going into his senior year, Scott was without a doubt the best player in the state of Virginia, but he was also looked at as one of the best players in the entire nation, and at the very least, its best guard, and he captured the accolades to back that up, being named Naismith Player of the Year behind averages of 24 points and 11 boards. As with Scott, the Falcons hadn't lost for 2 years, and he upped his All-American status again, while also being named a McDonald's All-American. Then in late March, he made his college decision, as he would continue his career at Georgia Tech. So Scott joined a Yellow Jackets team coached by Bobby Cremins, and had an immediate impact as a freshman, as the 6'8" swingman would act as one of the team's top scorers and rebounders. And while his overall defense was lackluster, his active hands had him averaging over a steal per game, and the accolades continued to pile up, as even in one of college basketball's toughest conferences, Scott was named Rookie of the Year, and the Yellow Jackets were looking good as well, as they started the year at 12-2, but would go 2-4 over their next 6. However, they would get back on track and win 7 of their final 9, yet their 2 losses came in the final 2 games, as they were trending in the wrong direction entering the conference tourney. And even though they had beaten Maryland twice, the Terps got their revenge in the quarterfinal game. But at 21-9, the Yellow Jackets got a tournament berth to take on Iowa State. And with Scott dropping 23 points with 5 3-pointers, the Yellow Jackets were advancing to round 2. Then although Scott tied for the team lead with 15 points, a horrible team shooting performance led to Georgia Tech falling to Richmond, as Scott wrapped up his freshman season with averages of about 15.5 points, 5 rebounds, and 3.5 assists per game. Scott had more responsibility as a sophomore, as one of Tech's best players from last year, in Dwayne Farrell, had moved on to the NBA, but they still had Scott and senior forward Tom Hammonds, each putting up over 20 points per game. And then there was guard Brian Olver, routinely stuffing the stat sheet. And while Scott's three-point percentage had dropped from 47 last year to a still impressive 40% this year, it's understandable, as out of his 16 shots per game, over 9 of those came from beyond the arc. And while Hammonds was getting a lot of attention, Scott was a catalyst in the Jackets starting strong at 10-2. But once again, conference play would slow them down. But near the end of the season on seniors night versus North Carolina, Scott hit his biggest 3 of the year.
And the inbound pass stolen by Scott! He scores! Dennis Scott!
To defeat 5th-ranked UNC in the final seconds. But a little over a week later, Georgia Tech had to beat them again, in the first round of the conference tourney. But UNC wouldn't let that happen twice. However, the Jackets would still receive a tournament bid to take on Texas in round 1, and while Scott would drop 16 points, he would foul out late, and the team would be bounced, as Scott's sophomore season ended with him averaging about 20.5 points, 4 rebounds, and 3 assists per game. And while Hammonds had graduated, Georgia Tech had signed a kid from New York, set to join the team for the 1990 season. So Georgia Tech welcomed one of the most coveted prospects in recent memory, in point guard Kenny Anderson, And after Scott had struggled with weight issues early in his college career, he had worked hard since his freshman season to stay at a lower weight, which would be helpful when playing with a fast-paced guard like Anderson. And with Anderson, Scott, and Olver beating defenses in every way imaginable, they were dubbed Lethal Weapon 3 as one of college basketball's most dangerous trios. And the 3 was represented in no one more than Scott, as he was attempting nearly 10 threes per game and making over 41% of them, with his 137 made threes being the most in the nation, leading to him being one of the country's best scorers at nearly 28 points per game. And the Yellow Jackets came out of the gate on fire, winning their first 10, and would finish the regular season with a 21-6 record and ranked in the top 15. And Scott would finally advance in the conference tourney after a quarterfinal win over NC State. Then the Jackets would beat a highly ranked Duke team in the semis, and they continued rolling, with a win over Virginia in the finals to capture the ACC title, as they were looking dangerous heading into the NCAA tournament. Scott would have a great tournament performance as he would kick off the first round with 36 points in a win over East Tennessee State. Then while his shot wasn't falling in a second round matchup with LSU, going just 10 of 32 from the field, he pulled down 11 rebounds, and his 5 3-pointers still helped him finish with 30 points, as a Yellow Jackets comeback got them to the Sweet 16 to take on Michigan State. And while this would be Scott's worst game, with 18 points on about 32% shooting, Kenny Anderson would send the game to overtime, and Scott would win it in the extra frame, to push Georgia Tech through to an Elite 8 matchup with Minnesota. And Scott would get back on track in a big way, as he drained 7 3-pointers against the Gophers, and overall finished with 40 points in another win. And now the Yellow Jackets were set to take on the Runnin' Rebels, with a trip to the national championship on the line. Scott was on fire in the first half, dropping 20 points and draining 4 3-pointers, as the Yellow Jackets carried a 7-point lead into the second half. But Stacey Augmon would lock in and hold Scott to just 9 second-half points, as the Rebels would pull away in the final 20 minutes to end a season which saw Scott earn first-team All-Conference and Conference Player of the Year honors, as well as a second-team All-American selection, behind averages of about 27.5 points, 6.5 rebounds, and 2 assists per game. And while Scott still had a year of eligibility left, he would decide to forego his senior year and enter the 1990 NBA draft. And while he wasn't a perfect player, most scouts agreed that he was one of the best shooters they had ever seen.
With the 4th pick in the 1990 NBA draft, the Orlando Magic select Dennis Scott from Georgia Tech.
So Dennis Scott was drafted to an Orlando Magic team in their second year of existence. And after signing a huge 5-year contract, he was hoped to be able to form a young nucleus with second-year guard Nick Anderson. And Scott would have an impressive rookie season on a Magic team who were in need of extra scoring, and specifically long-range shooting, after being one of the worst 3-point shooting teams in the league last year. So Scott came in and did what you'd expect of him, finishing in the league's top 5 for attempts and makes from deep, while even participating in the 3-point shootout. And he was able to get good looks, with the league's most improved player Scott Skiles getting him the ball, as he would finish as the team's second leading scorer, and by season's end, he would be named first team All-Rookie, while finishing 3rd in Rookie of the Year voting. But this was still an expansion team in their second year of existence, and not too much winning was expected, yet it was encouraging that they improved by 13 on last year's win total, to finish at 31-51, which still wouldn't be enough for a playoff berth, as Scott's rookie year ended with him averaging about 15.5 points, 3 rebounds, and 1.5 assists per game. The 1992 season started great for a second-year Dennis Scott and the Orlando Magic. The team would win their first 3 and were 5-3 after 8 games, and Scott had been taking on an even larger scoring role, as he played in 17 of the team's first 23 games and was averaging nearly 21 points, while hitting double figures in every game he appeared in. Yet the Magic had fallen into a losing skid, and were entering a December 22nd matchup with Houston, having lost 9 straight. And while this game would see them lose their 10th in a row, they would also lose Scott, who was their leading scorer at the time, as he never played again after this game due to a nagging thigh injury, with the Magic extending their losing streak to 17 games. And overall, Orlando would win just 15 more games after Scott went down, to finish with the league's second worst record at 21-61. But this also led to them getting some of the best odds in the upcoming draft lottery, a draft which had a generational giant coming out of LSU, as the consensus first overall pick, as Scott's shortened season had seen him average about 20 points, 3.5 rebounds, and 2 assists per game. But the Magic had struck gold, as they received the first overall pick in the 1992 NBA draft, and it was no secret who they were going to select. So the expectations for the Orlando Magic had been significantly raised overnight, with the team drafting future Rookie of the Year and all-time great Shaquille O'Neal, and Scott would immediately take O'Neal under his wing, explaining in later years that Shaq was his rookie, and that he was the only one that could get the big man to carry his bags. And while Shaq's mere arrival changed everything for the Magic, from the way they were traveling and were being treated overall, he also changed the way they played, and arguably nobody benefited from it more than 3D. Scott was back from injury, and with Shaq commanding so much attention down low, it led to Scott getting a lot of open looks when the defense collapsed on O'Neal. And Scott was eating, as over his first 28 games, he was averaging over 19 points, while shooting over 45% from beyond the arc. And the Magic were sitting at a respectable 14-14, but Scott couldn't escape injuries, appearing in just 7 games over the next 2.5 months due to calf and Achilles issues, with the Magic's patience growing thin, as they felt as though he could play if he wanted to. And even when he was playing consistently over the final month of the season, his numbers were down. However, he would still manage a career-high 41 points in a late-season win over Milwaukee. Yet the Magic could never really escape the 500 mark, as they would ultimately finish the year at 41-41 and miss the playoffs, as Scott's season ended with him averaging about 16 points, 3.5 rebounds, and 2.5 assists per game. But somehow, someway, the Magic landed the first overall pick for the second straight season. So after selecting Chris Webber, the Magic sent him to the Golden State Warriors, and in return received a package headlined by third overall pick Penny Hardaway. And now it just seemed like a matter of time before the Magic were the team to beat in the East. And on top of adding Penny, they had also added a new coach in Brian Hill. And Hill would decide to use Scott as a sixth man for over half the season, and it began quite well. But as Scott didn't see his minutes change with his solid play, he grew frustrated, which led to his play and minutes declining. And over his first 45 games, he was averaging less than 10 points, and was seeing his name come up in trade talks. But Hill would reinsert him into the starting lineup in early February, and the team would almost immediately rattle off a 7-game win streak. And over Scott's final 37 games, he saw a noticeable jump in his numbers, even averaging nearly 4 assists in that time. And although his minutes were limited for much of the season, his 155 made threes were still second in the league. And with Scott back as a starter, the Magic went 24-13 to finish with a then franchise record 50 wins, as the team was making their first playoff appearance to take on Indiana. Unfortunately, for as much talent as the young Magic had, they just weren't ready for an experienced Pacers team. And although Scott remained in a starting role and tied for third on the team in scoring at over 14 points per game, he didn't contribute much else, and was shooting below 35%, as the Pacers would take care of the Magic in a 3-game sweep, with Scott's year ending with him averaging about 13 points, 2.5 rebounds, and 2.5 assists per game. But now Orlando had gotten the playoff jitters out of the way, and were determined to make the 1995 season end differently. So while it hadn't been a perfect year for Scott, he had come on strong at the end, and most importantly, he had played all 82 games, after playing 72 games combined in the 2 years before that. But as Scott had spent some time at the Four last year out of necessity, Orlando addressed that need in the offseason, as they would sign longtime Chicago Bull Horace Grant. But after missing the first month of the season, Scott again looked like the odd one out, as upon return, he would receive less than 20 minutes of playing time over his first 3 games combined. But as the season went on, Scott was giving the Magic the most efficient production of his career off the bench, as someone who would come in and light it up. And after a brief midseason stint in the starting lineup, which didn't work out, Scott returned to the bench for his final 17 games of the year, and showed even better offensive production, while shooting about 50% from deep in that time. So while Scott wasn't the same superstar that he was in college, his first season in a primary bench role proved to be one of his best, as he recorded a then career-high shooting percentage and overall career-high 3-point percentage. And the Magic were a true contender, finishing with a conference-best 57-25 record, and entered the playoffs with a first-round matchup against Boston. Scott would play well in the first-round series, averaging over 13 points off the bench, and with him and Nick Anderson forcing defenses to come out on them, it left the key more open for Shaq and Penny, as overall the Magic would wrap up the series in 4 games, leading to a second-round matchup with a Michael Jordan-led Chicago Bulls team. However, there was an asterisk beside this team, as Jordan had returned just a couple months earlier from a season-and-a-half-long hiatus from the game. Scott would come out with 14 points in a Game 1 win, but after he went 1 for 9 in Game 2, the series was tied. But it became clear that the Bulls didn't have the interior defense needed to stop Shaq, and especially Grant. But a banged-up Donald Royal wasn't commanding much defensive attention, so to give his front court more room to operate, Hill would start Scott for Game 3, and the Magic would win. So now the Bulls were forced to pick their poison, and from Games 4 through 6, Scott torched Chicago, as he averaged 21 points while making 13 threes in that stretch, and the Magic would wrap up the series in 6 games, setting up another meeting with the Pacers, this time in the conference finals. Scott remained in his starting role for the Indiana series, as the Pacers became the next victim of his long-range marksmanship, with Scott averaging over 20 points and draining 18 three-pointers over the first 4 games. Yet it was a neck-and-neck series, with the teams deadlocked at 2 games apiece, and although Scott would have an off Game 5, over the final 2 games, he shot nearly 60% from the field and over 57% from deep, and the Magic would get their revenge for last year, as they won the series in 7 games, and were set to take on the defending champion Houston Rockets in the NBA Finals. Unfortunately, Scott's hot hand would cool off at the wrong time, as over the first 3 games, he would hit double figures just once, while shooting a combined 5 of 23 from deep. And for as good as Shaq and Penny were, they couldn't overcome the experience and great team play that the Rockets showcased. And even though Scott would have his best performance in Game 4, with 14 points on 5 of 11 shooting, the Rockets won convincingly, which marked their 4th win of the series, as the Magic were stunned in a 4-game sweep, with Scott's season ending with him averaging about 13 points, 2.5 rebounds, and 2 assists per game. But now going into the 96 season, Scott had earned back his starting role. While their season had ended in disappointment, there was no one that questioned the Magic's ability to return to the finals for many years to come, and they were confirming that with their best start in franchise history, going 13-2 over the first month, and even doing so without Shaq. And throughout this season, Scott was turning in a career year, as he was putting up career highs across the board for any season in which he played at least 20 games, and was doing it more efficiently than he ever had, as he would use his big frame and shooting ability for some higher percentage looks closer to the hoop. But Dennis Scott's bread and butter was always the 3-point shot, and that was never more clear during a record-breaking 1996 season, as he was taking nearly 8 threes per game while draining over 42% of them, which would get him a spot in the 3-point shootout. However, he would fail to take home the crown. But in the games that counted, no one was better this season. Dennis Scott was unconscious from beyond the arc, as not only would his 267 made threes lead the league, they would also set an NBA single-season record, which would stand for a decade, with this season including an April 18th win over the Hawks, where 3D would drain 11 three-pointers, which at the time was a single-game record. And even though this was accomplished with a shortened 3-point line, it still cemented Dennis Scott's status as an all-time marksman. So Scott was a perfect offensive fit for a Magic team who featured the league's most dominant inside presence, and one of its best slashers, as many kickouts found their way into his hands, and he would act as the team's 3rd leading scorer, as they would finish with a franchise record 60 wins to enter the playoffs as the 2 seed, to take on the Detroit Pistons. And Scott came out firing in Game 1, with 6 made threes en route to 23 points, as for the series he would drain 11 three-pointers while shooting nearly 59% from the field in a 3-game Magic sweep, as they were moving on to a second-round matchup with Atlanta. But Scott started going cold in this series, as although he would have good performances in Games 2 and 3, overall he would shoot below 40% from the field, yet would pick up some of the slack with one of the best rebounding series of his career. Yet the series was never really in doubt, as Orlando wrapped it up in 5 and were set to take on the Bulls with a trip to the finals on the line. But this was a different Bulls team from last year. The Magic looked doomed from the start, As yes, Jordan was back to being Jordan, and Chicago had added one of the best defenders of all time in Dennis Rodman. But Orlando's X Factor from last year in Horace Grant went down with an elbow injury in Game 1 and missed the rest of the series. And outside of Shaq and Penny, the Magic didn't get much from anyone else, including Scott, as he only averaged about 7 points while shooting below 27% from the field and going 3 of 19 from deep, as Orlando went down quietly in 4. And Scott's career year wrapped up with him averaging about 17.5 points, 4 rebounds, and 3 assists per game. But the once bright future of the Orlando Magic would disappear in the blink of an eye. In mid-July, the greatest player in the franchise's young history was gone, as Shaq bolted to the bright lights of LA. So now it was just the Penny-led Magic. And while they brought in a really solid replacement in Ronnie Cycli, he was no Shaq, so the team was bound to suffer. But now the two guys who had been there through all of it, in Dennis Scott and Nick Anderson, were struggling more than ever. Scott was still a starter, but he went from a career year to shooting below 40% from the field for the first time in his career, as his scoring dropped by 5 points per game. And while he was still a great 3-point shooter, without Shaq, teams didn't have to worry about doubling down low. And as Scott had never been the quickest guy off the dribble, he wouldn't get as many open looks. And the Magic were in even worse shape when Hardaway began to experience knee issues, as he would appear in just 5 games over the first 2 months of the season. And with Scott missing most of the first month with injuries of his own, the Magic got off to a poor start, and by mid-season, they were 24-25 when Hill was fired and replaced with Richie Adubato. And after the change, they would go 21-12 the rest of the way to get themselves a first-round matchup with Miami. However, Scott was dealing with knee issues and barely played in the first 3 games, as he would only play serious minutes over the final 2 games in a bench role with minimal contributions. And while Penny did everything he couldn't do it alone, as the Heat would take the series, with Scott's year seeing him average about 12.5 points, 3 rebounds, and 2 assists per game. But Scott was growing frustrated, and over the summer, he would show that frustration in a very public way. So going into the following season, Scott was displeased with his current contract, and threatened not to play for the team until a new deal was worked out. But at the same time, Scott was looking a lot leaner, with a lot of people speculating that his weight loss might be drug-related. Then in mid-July, at his 3D basketball camp, Scott went on an angry and confusing rant in front of nearly 200 child campers, venting about his anger towards the Magic and the anger inside of him.
Talking about live my life where I want to. So all y'all out there in America, if you scared, say you scared, but I ain't scared.
With Magic GM John Gabriel calling his behavior unacceptable. And then just a couple months later, Scott was traded to the Dallas Mavericks. So Scott would join a bad Dallas Mavericks team, led by Michael Finley, and would spend the majority of his time there as a starter, while acting as one of their top scorers. Yet the efficiency wasn't there, and with the Mavs looking more towards the future, they would actively shop Scott throughout the season, before trading him to Phoenix around the deadline. However, in Phoenix, Scott became a bench player, seeing his minutes cut by more than half than what he was getting in Dallas, as he put up modest numbers for a Suns team who would finish at 56-26 and make the playoffs. And while Scott would give the Suns 10 points off the bench in Game 1, this would be his peak, as he would score 7 more points over the rest of the series, as the Suns lost to the Spurs in 4, with Scott's year ending with him averaging about 11 points, 3 rebounds, and 2 assists per game. The Suns decided to release Scott after the season, and he would sign on with the New York Knicks, but he was a shell of his former self, and struggled to get playing time until he was waived prior to the deadline to sign with a playoff team, as he would be picked up by the Minnesota Timberwolves for the rest of the year, and would give them some solid production over his 21 games with the team, as they finished at 500 and got a first-round matchup with San Antonio. However, an injury kept Scott sidelined, as the T-Wolves lost, with Scott's year seeing him average about 6.5 points, 1.5 rebounds, and 1 assist per game. In late August, Scott signed on with the Vancouver Grizzlies, but once again injuries slowed him down, as a hamstring injury kept him out for the first month, and he would return to the team in a bench role, getting about 20 minutes a night, but he just wasn't what he once was, and the Grizzlies were still a relatively new and struggling expansion team, finishing at 22-60 and missing the playoffs, as Scott's year wrapped up with him averaging about 5.5 points, 1.5 rebounds, and 1 assist per game. But after signing with and being released by the Wizards before the 01 season, and failing to make a comeback with the Lakers the following year, Dennis Scott's NBA career officially came to an end. And while his career would end in disappointing fashion, he was able to find some success in broadcasting in his post-playing career, and remains a Magic fan favorite. Dennis Scott was just a fun and charismatic player, one of college basketball's most electrifying scorers in the late 80s, which had many believing he could be a future star. And with him needing to be a big-time scorer by necessity for the early Orlando Magic, everything seemed to be falling into place. And while it never seemed like he had issues with his teammates, it seemed that there may have been a lack of realization that the success of Shaq and Penny meant less opportunity for him. And when he finally seemed to understand that in '96, Shaq would leave and Penny's injury started, and it marked the beginning of the end for Dennis Scott's career. But while his prime was short, and he was easily overlooked due to the Magic's star duo, his direct and indirect contributions to the Magic's offense of that era is underappreciated. And who knows, if he doesn't get injured in late 1991, then maybe the Magic never get Shaq. But that's it for today's episode on 3D. Hope you enjoyed it, and make sure to subscribe for more videos like this one. If you liked it, check out this one on one of his Georgia Tech teammates, or this one on one of his 1990 draft mates. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.